Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you all, everyone, first of all, for coming out in this rainy and a little bit chilly weather. We really appreciate it. My name is Jessie, and I'm the Restoration Program Manager at Save the Bay, and I'm joined by many of my other wonderful colleagues and local partners who are also doing really incredible work. And we're just really grateful that you all decided to come out and join us and learn a little bit more about this project. This is a really interesting place to stand and look around and think about the history of the Bay. Behind you all over there, in front of me, is a salt pond that's actually still owned by Cargill. And Save the Bay has some history advocating to block that pond from being filled and developed, similar to Foster City, which is built on Bay Fill. Behind us, this beautiful park is actually built on a landfill. It's a former landfill that has been capped and is now used for recreation. So a good purpose of now being able to use this space as a park. But if you had come here 100 years ago, this all would have been part of the Bay. So we have a really interesting history. And then over the hill where we're going to be walking today is all U.S. Fish and Wildlife ponds that are really exciting because we just returned one of those ponds back to access to actual bay waters. So we're going to talk a lot about that today and about the restoration work that we have been doing there. Just a quick history of some of Save the Bay's restoration work, and Haley's going to talk about our policy work a little bit later. But Save the Bay has been doing restoration in the Bay for around 20 years and has been around as an organization for 60 years. And our restoration work started at two locations that are on a little bit of a smaller scale. So we work continuously at the Martin Luther King Jr. shoreline in Oakland, and also down at the Palo Alto Baylands in, you guessed it, Palo Alto. And both of those sites are on a much smaller scale. They're around 1 acre in size. They house our nurseries, and they're a really special space to engage community members in nursery programs, in public and community events. But after doing some of those projects, we realized that climate change is happening, sea level rise is happening, and as an organization, we really need to find a way to work on much larger scale and more rapid revegetation of these spaces if we're gonna help combat the effects of climate change. And so we got involved in a couple different projects. The first big one for testing some new restoration techniques was at Oraloma, which is over in Hayward. And it was a closed loop horizontal levee that was processing wastewater. None of that wastewater was being released out into the Bay, but it was a cycle to see how it would work to plant and use green infrastructure on that horizontal levee. At that space, we were propagating rhizomatous perennial plants on a really shortened timeline and at a large scale. Rhizomatous plants are plants that have an underground stem that can spread and multiply as part of their reproduction process. And then perennials come back year after year, of course. And so we had a lot of success there, and we're able to say, okay, this worked really well there. How can we do it at an even bigger site and have continued success to work on that large-scale revegetation? And the main project that we've been doing that at is here at Ravenswood. So when we go over the hill, we'll talk more about what that exactly looks like. And Colin, who also is here today, is going to talk to us about some more stuff with engineering. And I'll turn it over to you, Colin.
Let's see, this project has been going on since about 2018 or so. So these were all salt ponds that used to belong to Cargill. Cargill sold them to U.S. Fish and Wildlife back in the early 2000s. And then they were kind of in a state waiting to be restored. We basically broke this into 3 pond complexes. One you can't see right now behind this hill. When you first came in, there's a big red pump house, and kind of the pond behind that. It used to be several ponds. We connected those, and that's going to be a managed pond complex where they're going to keep the water level a couple of feet deep to target kind of diving ducks and waterfowl that use a little bit deeper water. And so they'll manage that. That one's also tied. There's a culvert that connects a flood control channel to that pond. And so during the winter, like right now, it doesn't have any water in it, or it's just got a little bit of water. And that flood control channel discharges into the bay. And on high tides, it's got tide gates on it, so it doesn't backwater. Well, when the tide gates are closed, all the drainage behind it stacks up behind those gates and then can't get out. And so historically it's flooded into parts of Redwood City. And I believe it was 2 years ago, they finished the project connecting that channel to the ponds. And so last year was the first year it was operational, and they saw basically no flooding. And last year was a pretty wet year. And we definitely saw, I think it activated about 9 or 10 times. So it was pretty cool to see. The other two pond complexes, Pond R3 is out here. It's the one that's wet right now that you can see back there. That's another managed pond, and that one is actually intended to be managed as a dry pond for the snowy plovers. So the western snowy plover is I believe it's a listed species as threatened, maybe not endangered yet, but so it's a real small little shorebird. They like to nest. Traditionally, they were nesting on beaches, and since a lot of the beaches have, there's more people out there, there's a lot of activity, they've kind of taken to these salt ponds as a surrogate for that. And so they nest out here a lot. And so that, right now they have water in it because they want to keep the vegetation from growing up in that. So during the winter, when it's not breeding season, they'll put some water in there for a few weeks, try to kill some of the vegetation, and then drain it back out. And then Pond R4, which is this big one behind me. So that one we breached to the bay, and so it's tidal now. In doing that, we built, improved an existing levee, or two existing levees that run out and separate R4 and R3 out there. And on that levee, and then along the edge of the landfill here, we have what we call habitat transition zones. And so that's a gentle slope. It rises about 1 foot in every 30 feet. And the purpose of that is to provide kind of some transitional habitat between a wetland or a mud flat in this case, up to kind of an upland area on the levee. And then also, as sea level rises, that gives the marsh somewhere to migrate to. And that's the part that Save the Bay has been planting, doing a lot of plantings out there. A couple things to note about that, and I don't know if you'll talk about this later, is that on those, the tide comes up at high tide. It's about halfway up those slopes. And so you'll notice a difference in vegetation, or right now there's maybe not much vegetation on that lower section. And that's because this was just breached back in December. And so that lower portion wasn't planted. And what happens is things like pickleweed and spartina, they wash in with the tides. And then those little, I guess it's the rhizomes, get established, in the soil there, and they'll just grow and spread. And there's some other areas in the project that we opened up about a year ago, and they've got a good amount of pickleweed on them already. The pickleweed is also what the salt marsh harvest mice like to nest in, and so we have a bunch of those out here, which those are also a threatened species. It always complicates construction when you have these species. When you're trying to work there, you have to clear vegetation basically by hand. So it adds a lot of complexity to the projects. Let's see, trying to think. I believe our total project cost on this was about $13 million, and it would have been a lot more, but we utilized what we call the free dirt method, which we have to import about 500,000 cubic yards of dirt, and that can be really, really expensive. And so whenever they're doing development in these areas, especially commercial developments, they have to dig out basements and foundations for these buildings. And so normally that dirt would be hauled off. They either take it to like a landfill to cap the landfill, or just another disposal site. And so what we do is we give them an alternative location that's closer, and so it's cheaper for them to haul the dirt there. And then we actually let them do it for free, or sometimes they actually pay us a couple dollars per load to bring the dirt. That kind of covers administrative cost. And so that's one reason this project took, about 5 years to complete, is you're kind of tied to that activity, and 2020 through 2022, it was pretty slow. The pandemic kind of killed some of that activity, put some projects on hold. Let's see, what else? So right now it's low tide. We had a low tide just a little bit before noon, I think. So one thing to pay attention to is the water level in this pond as kind of the afternoon goes on. Like, you may be able to see the change, by the time we wrap up today. Trying to think if there's anything else. There's a series of water control structures that lets them move water between ponds and manage those ponds. So you'll see those. They're kind of big concrete structures. And public access. So there is a trail. Are we going to walk out that way? Yeah. So we'll walk out on. There's a spot that's kind of graveled right now, and once we get some better weather, a little bit warmer, we're going to put down kind of a nicer surface on that trail, and then we have some public access features, some signage and some information stuff, and some benches and things like that. It'll connect basically from the corner of the park over to the Bay Trail along Highway 84, where the big yellow bridge is over there. And so yeah, it'll be open to use at that point.
Cool.
So, yeah.
I have a question for you, Colin.
Yeah.
So around the bay, right, there's been a lot of bayfill that has happened over the years to use what was once wetland for different purposes. Farming in the North Bay a lot more salt ponds in the South Bay. You can really see those salt ponds as you fly out of San Francisco Bay. I flew over this the other day, and it was really cool to see the breach from above. But often what happens when the ponds are diked, right, is that some of the land can subside and go down. Did any of that happen here that you had to fill?
Yeah, so it does subside, and it's actually worse where it's farmed than the salt ponds generally, because a lot of the soils have organic matter in them, and it's so long as they're covered with water, it doesn't oxidize. But once they get dried out and exposed to oxygen, that material actually basically decomposes and oxidizes, and so the soil will basically settle. And so there's a lot of places around the bay, in the delta is where you see a lot of it, where that land has subsided. And so if you just open it back up, depending on how deep it is, it may be a long time before you get any marsh or anything that develops, if it ever does. Here with the salt ponds, a lot of times they kept those wet, and so you get less of that. But this elevation, so the elevation out here is about 4.5 on most of this pond you see. High tide, average high tide is around 7 feet. And so in order for this to develop marsh, it needs to come up in elevation about 1.5 foot, 1.5 feet. And what we do on projects like this, it's pretty passive. To bring in dirt to raise all that would just take a long time and be very expensive. There's some places where we are doing it around the bay where we bring in dredged material and they pump it in, and then you let that settle down, and then you can create channels and things like that. But here what we're doing is we're just counting on the bay to bring in sediment passively, and so it'll accrete sediment. It may take, sites like this, it may take 15, 20 years, maybe even longer to develop like a full marsh, but eventually it'll get there. So
How big is the area?
let's see, I believe this pond is about 300 acres, I believe. R3 is another one that's about 300 acres, and then that first managed pond is about 70 acres. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really cool to look over here and see these 3 pond complexes, and I'm learning a lot about each of these complexes as we're standing here right now. But at Save the Bay too, right, we're really thinking about protecting the bay for people and wildlife, and so it's cool to hear that that first pond complex has helped prevent flooding for communities nearby. The second pond complex is being managed for birds. And then at Save the Bay, we're also helping create habitat along this transition zone. Save the Bay specifically works in the habitat transition zone, which is that area between upland and intertidal, trying to create that habitat for wildlife like the salt marsh harvest mouse, like the ridgeways rail, which are both species that are endemic only here, which they're endemic, meaning they only live here in the San Francisco Bay. So really focusing our work to highlight those species. We are going to talk about vegetation in just a second, but any other questions for Colin about engineering while we're up here or about Ducks Unlimited work? Awesome, yeah. So like I was saying, we really focus on the habitat transition zone. Not only is this really important habitat for wildlife because it is really that like buffer between the upland and the intertidal, but also because it's an area that's really heavily impacted by sea level rise, right? That is an area where as the water is rising, the habitat is really, really changing. And the intertidal zone, like Colin said, bits of pickleweed, bits of other plant material can come in, spread their seeds, and really establish themselves. It might take 15 years, but it'll kind of do it passively. But in that transition zone, it's a little bit harder. We have competition from non-native invasives that are coming in on people's shoes from the upland. There's sea level rise, which if there's not an established seed bank, things might be eroding. And so Save the Bay really focuses on coming into that area. And by planting in that zone, we are speeding up the process. It's a more rapid revegetation because we're putting in plants, native plants that are growing there. Our work also really focuses on rhizomatous plant material, which again is that material that can spread its little underground stems upslope. And we focus on that plant material, one, because it can spread, which means that as sea level rise happens, if there is space for it to migrate upslope, it will do so. It'll say, oh, it's too salty down here, oh, it's too wet, I'm gonna migrate upslope, and we don't have to do anything to tell it to do that. So it will continue sort of like restoring itself as it goes along. We also have transitioned to that rhizomatous plant material versus larger shrubby plant material because it's great habitat, but it's also really great at capturing soil and helping to build that soil and trap that soil instead of eroding. If we were planting big shrubs like we used to, they were great, but if sea level rose, those roots would sense that salt, they'd die off, and then they'd leave big gaps in the slope, which could then be filled in by a bunch of invasives, and then we're kind of always battling that. So that's the reason we're making those choices when we're looking at the planting palette that we're selecting for out here. Like Lisa said, just below us is a strip that we call the R4 levee. The other one is also on the R4 ponds, but that's what we're calling it today. So that's the R4 levee. That one is a 9.6 acre site that we started planting in 2021. So we'll be able to go walk down part of that slope and you'll see what it looks like a couple years after being restored. And then we're gonna walk out to just the start of our other 16 acre site. We call it the All-American Canal. You can see some like light green over there. Ooh, beautiful. That's part of that new site and you'll be able to see what it looks like. We just started planting it. The first day we planted was November 16th. So what does it look like after just a couple months of restoration, which will be cool to compare and contrast. What else did I want to tell you? Oh, also really interesting, as Colin said, did anyone see the levee breach on the news? Cool, yeah, a couple of people. If you get excited, you can search it and you can watch. It's really cool. There's some like aerial shots and whatnot of the levee being breached. But when the R4 pond or when the R4 levee was planted, it wasn't exposed to the tides. And so Ducks Unlimited came out and estimated where those tide lines were gonna fall. We planted based on that. But you're like, well, what does it look like when it actually has water in it is gonna be a little bit different. When we planted the All-American Canal, we mostly did that planting after the breach. And so being able to compare and contrast that is also really interesting, and seeing what does it say in theory, what does it look like in real time has been a really big learning lesson. We also have, if you were to come back on maybe a nicer day when you want to stroll around a little longer, if you were to go that way, we have a nursery that's adjacent to the project site where we were growing all of these rhizomatous perennial species and transporting them to the site. We chose to grow things in beds, which looks really different than some of our other small scale sites, because growing perennials in a bed where they spread themselves out and reproduce over time versus growing plants in a nursery is, number one, very cost effective and allows us to grow thousands and thousands of plants in a really small space versus like our capacity at a nursery, which is only 40,000 plants for a year. Instead, we can grow like hundreds of thousands of plants for cheaper and in the same space. So that's a cool thing to check out. But let's get moving.
Alrighty, everyone, let's huddle in a little bit. I wanted to talk to you guys about the revegetation methods that we used here. I want to talk about why we use them, so I'll start with that. So the revegetation methods that were used for this project were guided by Peter Bay. He's a plant ecologist. He specializes in coastal plant communities. There were 4 phases that we used when we do revegetation that were used at both R4 and at All-American Canal. Each of the planting phases has a unique set of species that were selected based on planting method and in support of our overall restoration goals. So our first phase was clono meadow species. These are clono meadow species are stress tolerant not only to drought and salt, but they can handle a tractor being driven over them and then cut into even smaller pieces. We chose this because they take up a slope pretty readily. Those 4 species that are getting passed around are alkali heath. We might be able to see, and I'll point those out. We have creeping wildfire, western ragweed, and saltgrass. Our second phase that we did was diversity patch species. These provide cover and biodiversity and pollinator habitat, and they're less stress tolerant and can't stand the mechanical planting. Those are mugwort, yarrow, iris leaf rush, western goldenrod, and marsh baccharis, and among others. And you're going to see them planted around here. They're in 5x5 grids as we're walking down the slope. We'll point those out too. Our third phase was refuge species. These provide dense high tide refugia for the salt marsh harvest mice and so on and so forth during high tide. And then our fourth phase was we hand spread the annual cover crop. This allowed them to establish themselves on bare soil even before the non-natives were able to have a chance to grow. So now that we know the why, I'm gonna tell you how. So the planting techniques happened. In October to November, we were focused on site and sod preparation. The site preparation included hand pulling 15 tons of weeds from the slope. That was done by Save the Bay staff and San Jose Conservation Corps. This was even before Farmer Frank, our friendly farmer, was able to disc the slope to break up that soil because it was graded over and pretty compact. So after that, our staff prepared for the sod for the clono meadow species from our division beds that Jesse was talking about earlier. The clono meadow species were planted, or you'll see them around. Recall that these species were selected because they can handle a great deal of physical disturbance. And on the R4 Levee project, this specific site, we were testing the ability for its ability to withstand mechanized planting. Yes. So after the clono sod pieces were laid out, we hand planted them hand laid them on the entirety of the slope. After they were laid onto the slope, Farmer Frank came back to the site to disc those species in with the tractor and discer. A discer is basically a giant spiral blade that cuts whatever's in its path into smaller chunks. When it rolls over the sod pieces, it splits that rhizomatous sod into smaller chunks, and they can better establish themselves quickly across the entirety of the slope. And note, it took us 3 afternoons to be able to plant what would otherwise take us more than a full season if we planted with just container plants. So very efficient.
I just want to repeat that again because that was like one of our biggest learning lessons. That was so cool. Like, this is a huge site. Our team is 10 people. We get volunteers, but we first planted this during COVID, so we couldn't have volunteers out at the site with us. And so to plant this whole site with all of this material would have taken us at minimum 1 full season. But because we had that mechanized equipment, we planted it in 3 days. And then we added more, which gave more diversity. But like, That is insane for us. That's like really incredible.
Yeah, it was. Thank you, Jesse. Okay, so after we dissed those clonomeadow species in, we hand broadcasted the native seed cover, timing the dispersal with rain as close as possible. And the next planting phase, we hand planted our diversity patch species across the slope. These species were less abundant in our beds and less stress tolerant. They provide, like I said before, vital pollinator habitat and biodiversity. And then you can see them planted in 5x5 grids. And finally, last but not least, our refuge patch. We came in and we planted 3,800 container plants along the slope with the predicted channels, and they provide dense shrubbery high tide refugia. Yeah, and then of course we weeded, we watered, and gave it a lot of love.
Just real quick, a couple of the things that we have learned from this site. I mean, there's abundant things that we've learned. We're still learning now that this site is actually exposed to water, right? Like maybe we've lost some plants that were covered with some of that water that we could have planted higher. So we're learning a ton. A couple of the quick things that we learned is that the annual seed mix, incredible. It spread across the slope, it outcompeted natives, and it reseeded itself so that the next year we didn't have to do more reseeding. If you come out here in the spring or again in the fall, you'll see this whole site covered with tarweed. We come out here and monitor, and our boots and our pants are absolutely black with tarweed. Martin can attest, I am sure. We also learned just how quickly that material can get out here, but you know, it's great. We're not like hands planting a million container plants, but it is a lot of hard work for our team. Cutting sod out of beds that's like 6 inches deep is really, really hard work. So we need a bigger team to help us do that. We need support from volunteers to help us do that. And so thinking about that is really important. Also just thinking about how weather affects our ability to access the slope, right? The All-American Canal, the rain started a little late, but we haven't really been able to get out to access that site in a while because the levees are too wet and it's unsafe for us to be out there. So how does that affect when and why we do things? And our ability to irrigate the slope, again, tough. It's a rainy day, it's beautiful, but we live in California. There's a lot of drought. Some years are better than others, and so how does that affect survival is something that we're doing with our monitoring program.
Which one do you want to do, Jesse?
Any.
Amsinkia?
That's what I was thinking.
Oh, lovely, lovely plant. This is part of our annual seed mix, and it's so great to see them coming up year after year. This is called fiddleneck or common fiddleneck. Oh, and they're just so lovely. Oh, they're just so lovely. Did you want to add anything, Jesse?
No, just sometimes you'll like drive along, even if you were kind of to drive along where this yellow bridge is, there can be just total fields of it. At Save the Bay, we have special seed collection permits that allow us to go out to some of the local parks. So all of our native seed mix, for the most part, is seed that our nursery manager has collected from around the bay with these special permits. For this site, because it was so large, we collected seed and then we did send seed to a native plant nursery that then amplified that seed so we could have enough without collecting for years and years. But yeah, it's all generally sourced from a local population. One of those populations being over there by that yellow bridge where I remember spending like a hot summer day getting Amsinkia seeds. And then now they're out here, which is really cool.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I just wanted to point out, you know how we said that clonomeadow species, they establish themselves and spread onto the slope really quickly? I just wanted to point this out. This is so amazing to me, y'all. This is one sod piece, but you're starting to see them spread. This is another part of it and possibly spread this way. There's another one right over here, but they're starting to pop up everywhere. Oh, this is so cool.
And the goal is that that will become a meadow of sorts, right? So really will fill out over time. Again, really interesting in situ to see like, wow, that water came up really high. Did we expect that? How is the growth going on down below where that water and tide line has come up? We don't know yet. We'll see during monitoring season and have a chance to really analyze some of that data, which is cool.
How do you tell a weed from a native?
Great question. I mean, a weed theoretically could be anything growing where you don't want it to grow, right? So, but you know, I mean, it really depends. We do a lot of training to identify plants and then know which ones are non-native invasive, which ones are native. There's non-natives, there's invasives, there's natives. Non-natives are just not from here. I like to say no plant is bad, right? Everyone has plants that they probably feel connected to in different ways, whether it's a source of food or a flower you really like, and people bring and carry plants with them everywhere, right? So no plant is bad. Some plants are just really, really, really good at surviving and thriving. And so those are the plants that we're focusing on. Those are the plants that come in, they grow so fast, so quickly that they take over and nothing else can compete with them because they're growing too slow. So we could never weed every single weed off of this slope. But what we're doing is we're saying certain plants like clover, which this is the stalk of a clover. Certain plants like clover, we focus on. They have pretty big leaves. You can see a couple here as I pass them around, a couple seeds still on here, but every clover plant produces like 400 seeds that as you brush by them in the dry summer, just shatter and scatter. So it's gonna reproduce itself. So we're focusing on something like clover. What's another one we're focusing on? Russian thistle is another one we really focus on. It's great. I saw a bunch of it with Colin a minute ago. Not in this, okay, yeah, here. This is a little tiny Russian thistle, and it's so cute, and it's so unassuming, and you're like, wow, you're nice. And then it gets big, and when it gets big, it becomes a tumbleweed that's like this big, and it's very spiky, and we pulled 15 tons of it off the slope this winter, which is wild. So things like that are really good at spreading, they're really good at taking over. And then we're just, you know, if we're targeting 5 main weeds here, we get to know those weeds really well in all their stages and say, okay, this is what we're looking for. Great question. Awesome. Let's keep going that way.
Okay, here, I'll stand back so you can hear me. As I said before, I'm Haley Courier. I'm one of the policy managers at Save the Bay. And one of the things I really like, can you hear me back there? Yeah, okay. One of the things I really like about working at Save the Bay is that we do our work from multiple sides. So we've been talking a lot about our restoration work here and all the amazing work our habitat restoration team does to get this land looking the way that it does. We also have an education program where we bring young people out to the shoreline, and we have our policy advocacy, and that's my job. And our policy advocacy is focused on 2 buckets of work. We do pollution prevention, as well as climate resilience focused on flooding. Because of climate change, we see flooding from 3 different sides. We see, of course, sea level rise, we see intensifying storms, which means that not only do we have more storms, but more water falls at one time. And then we see groundwater rise. Who has heard of the issue of groundwater rise? Okay, so a good amount of you. Groundwater rise is, there's actually the water table below us, and at the shoreline, and in the coast, you know, within a few thousand feet, maybe a mile, the water is actually very shallow. So when it rains, that groundwater gets even more shallow. And as the sea level rises, it pushes the groundwater up from below, which means we're gonna have flooding away from the shoreline and not just in creeks, but also in these places where groundwater is shallow. So what we want to make sure we're doing is that cities across the Bay Area are planning for the impacts of climate change from all 3 sides: sea level rise, groundwater rise, and stormwater flooding. And so that's what our advocacy program is focused on. We have actually a whole approach that we've outlined in our sea level rise and flood resilience strategy that has 7 different policy priorities that we think the Bay Area needs to do at the local, regional, state, and federal level to make sure our cities are protected and our communities are protected from the impacts. 3 guiding principles for that approach are focus on nature-based solutions. And that's what we've been talking about here. Wetland restoration, horizontal levees, are a nature-based solution to protect our communities from sea level rise. Sometimes we build seawalls and we build more traditional levees. Sometimes that's the only option. But wherever possible, restoring wetlands is protecting, blocking sea level rise absorbing storm surge, protecting all of this development here, the communities along here, as well as, of course, providing habitat, recreation. It's also a carbon sink. Nature-based solutions have all these different benefits that if we invest in them, we're going to see so many more benefits for our communities. So nature-based solutions is the first piece. The second piece is centering frontline communities. Frontline communities are those who have been disproportionately impacted and burdened by our planning decisions and our policies. And those communities are often going to feel the impacts of climate change first and worst. So we want to make sure if we're deciding where to prioritize our projects and our input and whose voices need to be guiding our priorities, we focus on frontline communities. And third, build for the future. We know that climate change is here, and we want to make sure that we're protecting what we have and making decisions about building for the future in a way that's taking into account climate change. So that's kind of our policy approach to our climate resilience work. Some of the ways that we're trying to make an impact is, and kind of aligning our work, I'm sinking into the mud here, is all of this, we need a positive, supportive policy environment to ensure that projects like this happen and to ensure that we're prioritizing nature-based solutions. Without the advocacy of groups like Save the Bay and lots of other partners, cities are just going to build seawalls. That's what we've been doing for 100 years. That's what we know how to do. We need to push our elected officials and our decision makers to be prioritizing things like wetland restoration. The second thing we need to do is get more money. We were talking about how much this costs, like $13 million. This is expensive. We need, our staff of 8 of Save the Bay needs to be a staff of 500. We need so much more money to be able to make these projects happen. So the ways that we create a supportive policy environment and we get more money is that we try to influence the planning processes in cities. So we have a whole list of priority best practices when it comes to flood resilience policies. And we go to a bunch of cities and we go to the region, we go to the state, we say, make sure when you are planning for your infrastructure, you are thinking about climate resilience. And we have about 30 different policies that we go and we advocate for, and we build relationships with elected officials. We partner with community groups and other advocacy groups, and we say, when you are planning, you must plan for climate change. It's here, protect us. Make sure you're thinking about that. And when we're thinking about funding, we do that at the federal, state, and local level. At the federal level, actually, David Lewis, our executive director, is in DC right now, talking to our elected official, to our Congress people, to make sure that we can protect the money that we get from the federal government that goes to restoration and bay pollution prevention. We actually used to get about $5 million a year, then it was like $12 million a year, not Save the Bay, but the region, in an EPA program called the Bay Restoration Program. And just last year, for the first time, we finally got $52 million a year as a built-in line item. That's right, woo-hoo! A built-in line item in the federal budget. Do you know how hard it is to get anything in the federal government to happen? And we got $52 million a year. Guaranteed, I mean, nothing's guaranteed, but pretty much as good as guaranteed as you can get. And that's due to our long-term advocacy with lots of other partners, ensuring that Dianne Feinstein was a huge champion of this to make sure that this would happen. And so David's there in DC right now to make sure that that money is protected and grown, because this is such an important estuary, it really deserves federal funding. We also advocate at the state, in the state budget. You may have heard that we have a massive deficit at the state this year, and we had big surplus last year, and so we're making sure that all of the money that's been dedicated to coastline resilience, to flood resilience, that we won last year is staying in the budget this year. And we won't get it all because there's not enough money. So we're also advocating for a climate bond. That's something that the legislature is putting together and will go on the ballot this November, which will be billions of dollars for things like shoreline restoration to ensure that we're protected from the impacts of climate change. And then we also work at the local level. Right now I'm working on a stormwater ballot measure in San Leandro, and there's these measures all over the place, which is a way to raise money to improve the stormwater system, to ensure that cities are protected from floods, because as these floods get as these storms get bigger and more intense, the systems that we have were not built for these big intense storms, and they get overwhelmed, and then communities get flooded. And there's nature-based solutions to address stormwater flooding too. It's called green stormwater infrastructure. And those are things along streets. You might have seen planters along streets that collect water. So we're working on local measures that will raise money to support our stormwater system to ensure that cities are protected from all three sides. So that's a little overview of our policy work, and I will say we're going to send you a petition. That climate bond is no guarantee. Our legislators need to hear from us that this is important, that this is what we want to spend our money on. So we'll send you a follow-up petition. You can sign that so that our legislators know that we care about this. And I'm happy to answer any questions as we walk away from the rain. Thank you for listening to me in the downpour.
Just thank you all again. This was damper than we anticipated. We hope that you've enjoyed being out here with us and braving the weather. Yeah.